Thanks, Senator Sessions. I ask consent that 12 statements be placed in the record as part of the committee hearing.
Without objection, yes.
Thank you. We are facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the history of the world. More than 65 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes. The brutal Syrian conflict, the epicenter of this crisis, has killed hundreds of thousands, injured more than 1 million, and displaced more than half of Syria's entire population. In some areas, children are starving to death. An entire generation of children has known nothing but war. A new UNICEF report finds that 28 million children around the world have fled their homes due to conflict. 8.4 million Syrian children in need of humanitarian aid. 2.8 million Syrian children no longer in school, 2.4 million refugees. UNICEF says, and I quote, "No place is safe for children in Syria. Violence has become commonplace, reaching family homes, playgrounds, schools, parks, and places of worship." Imagine what it must be like to be a mother or father in Syria, this war-torn country, the impossible choices you face. If you stay, your child could be bombed, like Amran Daknish, a 5-year-old boy who was injured and whose brother was killed by a recent military strike. If you flee, your child could die before your eyes, like 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, who drowned last year in the Mediterranean Sea with his older brother and mother. Here's what Somali refugee Warsan Shear said about the impossible choice refugees face, and I quote, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." I'd like to show you another photo of a young refugee. His name is Emir Hadzik. Emir was a Muslim refugee who fled Sarajevo in 1995 and came to the United States at the age of 17. Emir became the first Bosnian American to serve in the United States Marine Corps. He is a veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he is deployed 8 separate times in service of this nation. He retired after 20 years as a U.S. Marine. This former refugee returned to his hometown of St. Louis, where he is currently a police officer. For those who proclaim that Muslim refugees are a threat to America, please come to know retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Hadzik. Emir is now part of Veterans for American Ideals, a group of American veterans that support refugees. They argue that accepting refugees is not just the right thing to do, it's important for America's national security. Emir is here with us today. He is joined by Scott Cooper, a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, and Andy Slivka, a retired Marine Sergeant, who've been fighting to save the lives of Afghan and Iraqi translators, largely Muslim translators, who literally risked their lives to protect America's troops. I'd like to acknowledge these outstanding American veterans and ask them to please stand. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for your service.
We are also joined by a number of refugees from around the United States. They live in states like Georgia, Texas, Vermont, and Illinois, and among them are professors, lawyers, business owners, an Episcopal priest, and a famous actor. Would our refugee guests please stand to be acknowledged? Thank you as well for being here today. Each of them has an amazing story to tell. Veterans for American Ideals are not alone in arguing that accepting refugees protects America. Listen to what Michael Hayden, former director of the CIA and the NSA under President Bush, and James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, said. Here's what they said about refugees. "It's ironic, to say the least, that today some politicians are seeking to shut out refugees in the name of national security. The global refugee crisis is straining the resources and infrastructure of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, who are hosting the vast majority of Syrian refugees. By doing more to host and help these refugees, the United States safeguards the stability of these nations and advances our own national security interest. Moreover, hostility to refugees helps ISIS. Conversely, welcoming refugees, regardless of their religion, nationality, or race, exposes the falseness of terrorist propaganda and counters the warped vision of extremists. Now, let's be clear about these refugees. Many of them wait months, if not years, to come to the United States while they're being carefully screened and vetted. Before they are admitted, they must pass careful, rigorous security screenings. All of that screening takes place before they ever set foot in America. Syrian refugees are subjected to another enhanced review or stricter screening. If there's anything we can do to make that process more secure, sign me up. But if Republicans are serious about securing our country from threats, they should focus on other areas. Consider the visa waiver program. Listen, 20 million people from 38 nations travel to the United States each year, 20 million, without visas. That's 1/3 of all foreign visitors to the United States. They arrive at our airports without undergoing biometric checks. Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker and 9/11 co-conspirator, tried to enter through the visa waiver program. So did Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Every participant in the terrorist attack on the Bataclan Theater last year in Paris held a passport from a visa waiver program country. So if we're really concerned about protecting America from terrorists, how about strengthening the visa waiver program and requiring biometric checks of travelers before they reach America so that we know who they are before they board a plane? And if we're serious about protecting America, Congress should close the loophole that lets people who enter the U.S. through the visa waiver program buy guns, even assault weapons, and even if they're on the FBI's terrorist watch list. And speaking of gun violence, every day in America, around 300 men, women, and children are shot, and 90 of them die. The American Medical Association has declared gun violence is a public health crisis. What has the Judiciary Committee done about these real threats that face us since the Republicans took control in January of 2015? Nothing. Nothing. No hearings, no legislation on the visa waiver program, on the terror loophole to buy guns, or on gun violence epidemic. Instead of these real security threats, we're talking about innocent men, women, and children who are fleeing terrorism. We can't forget the lessons of history. Fortunately, some have not. Last year, the Senate received a letter from more than 1,000 Jewish rabbis who opposed restrictions on refugee settlement. They have not forgotten. They have not forgotten how in 1939 the United States turned away the SS St. Louis as it tried to dock in our country and save 900 Jewish refugees from the Nazi Holocaust. America turned the ship away. The 900 returned to Europe, and many died in concentration camps. These rabbis said, and I quote, "In 1939, our country could not tell the difference between the actual enemy and the victims of an enemy. Today, let us not make the same mistake." In the aftermath of our tragic failure, these Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler, many of them, went back to their death. And we changed after World War II, after taking a close look at our policies during that war. Since World War II, the American people have set out to create an example for the world when it came to refugees. Consider these numbers as we talk about the possibility of 10,000 or 20,000 more Syrian refugees. Almost 400,000 Eastern Europeans admitted as refugees after World War II into the United States. Close to 400,000 Vietnamese refugees fleeing the Vietnam War admitted as refugees into the United States. Approximately 650,000 Cuban refugees were admitted into the United States after Castro came to power and was clearly enthralled by our mortal enemy, the Soviet Union. 650,000 Cuban refugees came to this country. Some of them were the fathers and grandfathers of the 3 Cuban American senators that we serve with today. Is there anyone who questions whether these Cuban Americans have made a positive contribution to this country? And we accepted more than 150,000 refugees from former Yugoslavia. The list goes on. Soviet Jews, so many others. Many of these refugees were fleeing regimes hostile to the United States, and many of their critics argued they could be spies. Hostile elements could be among them. But the United States did the background checks, not nearly to the extent that we do today. We were not dissuaded by this fear and hate that we heard. President Ronald Reagan called America a shining city on the hill whose doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to come here. Here's what he said about refugees. I'm quoting Republican President Ronald Reagan. Here's what he said. We shall continue America's tradition as a land that welcomes people from other countries. We shall, with other countries, continue to share in the responsibility of welcoming and resettling those who flee oppression. Ronald Reagan. Compare that with the current Republican presidential nominee. Notwithstanding his own immigrant mother, 2 immigrant wives, and the hard work of immigrants who contribute to his company and his wealth, Donald Trump and his loyalists have made demonizing immigrants and refugees a key plank of their party platform. Well, America cannot build its future on fear and hate. Today's refugees, like millions before them from all over the world, will become proud Americans who contribute greatly, like Amir Hedzik. Building walls on our borders and fear in our hearts will not move this nation forward. Let's not continue the cruelty and deception of blaming immigrants and refugees for security and economic challenges. Let's work together to build a better America for all Americans, including new Americans, no matter the color of our skin, where our parents were born, or how we pray.